Gremlins, a film about a young man who receives a cute but dangerous creature as a Christmas gift. It is both funny and scary, but it's not a straight horror film, and not really a comedy either. Its spirit is often mean, but it is also very sweet and moving. By mixing the fun of naughty puppet creatures with more adult-centric violence and scares, the film did garner some controversy on release. Many parents felt it was marketed as a non-threatening children's movie, only to discover its much darker reality. This reportedly caused complaints and even some audience walkouts at cinemas in the USA. It was felt that the film's parental guidance content rating, issued by the Motion Picture Association of America, was deemed to be a choice lacking responsibility on the part of the filmmakers. This contributed, at least partially, to the creation of the PG-13 rating for films of this nature.
A child under the age of 13 will not be allowed to enter a movie rated PG-13 unless they are accompanied by an adult.
The PG-13 rating came into effect less than a month after Gremlins hit cinemas. Nevertheless, on release in the summer of 1984, Gremlins was a huge box office success and has since become a Christmas favourite for many. But how and why did the people behind and in front of the camera create an original story with such an interesting tonal balance? Where did this quirky idea originate from, and why exactly was it developed into its own unique tale for the big screen of 1984? Why does this movie work so well? What is it exactly that makes Gremlins a great film? To answer this, let's first ask, what is a gremlin? European folklore has always had stories of naughty little creatures, goblins and imps, causing havoc with human beings. According to Joseph T. Shipley in 1945, the word gremlin perhaps has its roots in the Old English word grem, which means to vex, or goblin, mixed with the Irish word gruimen, an ill-tempered man. However, with the rise of aviation in the 1910s and 1920s, the word became commonly used in Britain's Royal Air Force as a scapegoat for faulty airborne technology, the notion of a little monster wrecking the internals of a flying vehicle as both a nuisance and a menace. Shipley also speculated that the word gremlin had come from an air pilot who crashed after drinking the Fremlin's brand of beer. While the word gremlin had apparently appeared in print during the 1920s and before, to the best of my research, in 1934 it was first used specifically in a published creative context as a name for mischievous creatures destroying air technology. It appeared in the book Piffling Poems for Pilots, which was written by pioneering British aviator Pauline Gower. In it is a poem about a man flying a plane over misty moorlands and rugged terrain, an environment rife with scissor-wielding, aeroplane-sabotaging gremlins. After hearing the gremlins attack his plane, the pilot spins it in terror and crashes on a hillside. Gower told of how this applied to areas particularly high up or covered in cloud, where the gremlins appeared accompanied by glugging and bubbling sounds. In her later 1938 book, Women with Wings, Gower explained how a pilot named Jerry Chambers had told tales of weird little creatures who fly about in the air holding scissors, landing on the wings of planes of pilots who were lost or in difficulty. These gremlins attack during bad weather at heights no more than 3,000 feet in the air. One day, Gower and colleagues made a flight from Barrow-on-Furness in North England to Hawick in Scotland. The day was forecast to be clear, but ended up being very cloudy. Gower and her flying partner Dorothy Spicer flew 4,000 feet in the air and avoided much of the cloud, but other pilots following her, such as Chambers, all came to land with stories of gremlins attacking them. Pauline Gower also drew in her book what seems to be the very first illustration of a gremlin, based on how she believed they looked according to various accounts. As the air battles of World War II began, the scapegoating of gremlins for human error was used as morale-boosting propaganda for the British and American forces. It wasn't long before Hollywood wanted a piece of the gremlins. This unexpectedly came via Welsh-born writer Roald Dahl. Dahl joined World War II as an RAF pilot, but following a 1940 crash in the Sahara Desert, he could no longer fly. He was then dispatched to Washington, D.C. as a military attaché to the British Embassy. During this time, based on his experiences as a pilot, he wrote his own adaptation of the mythical Gremlins. Through a movie producer called Sidney Bernstein, who happened to be the head of British Information Services in New York, the story was sent to Walt Disney, who loved the material and wanted to turn it into an animated movie. It was ripe for Disney's move into wartime training films. Proceeds for Disney's planned Gremlins film would go to the RAF Benevolent Fund. 26-year-old Dahl was given leave, and in 1942 he went to work on the film for Disney in Hollywood. There was just one key issue. As the story of the Gremlins was well known throughout the RAF, and stories had already appeared published, ownership of the creatures could not be claimed. The film did not come to fruition, but in 1943, Random House released a book called The Gremlins, credited to Dahl and illustrated by Bill Justice. The story is centered around a pilot named Gus, in his Hurricane plane at 18,000 feet, flying 300 miles per hour. A little creature, 6 inches high, with horns on its head and wearing suction boots, is drilling into the plane's wing. Gus tries to spin the creature off the plane, but it continues and drills into the engine. Gus then coins the word gremlin to describe this kind of a creature. Across the global RAF, this word was now known. Gus reunites and has a conversation with his friends at his RAF base. A mug then topples over to reveal a well-dressed little older gremlin with a deep voice, wearing suction boots. The creature looks up at Gus and his friends. Gus names the character as Gremlin Gus. The little man wanders off, mulling about having a date with a Fifinella. Gremlin Gus then explains to the other gremlins that as creatures they are no longer a secret and can now work in the open. 3 days later, a female gremlin known as a Fifinella introduces herself. When it's asked where the gremlins came from, Gus explains that at the beginning of time, England was a forest swamp full of pixies and goblins. In the north was a beautiful green wood full of gremlins who used their suction shoes to walk upside down on branches. It was a very happy life. But then the humans came and destroyed the surroundings, chopping the trees, flattening the forest, and eventually building factories that made airplanes. For this, the gremlins decided to seek revenge. It is then discovered that the gremlins can be tamed by feeding them old postage stamps. After Gremlin Gus tries to destroy Gus's own plane in a fight with the German Henkel, Gus proposes to the creature that the species team up and fight the enemy together. He promises that when the war ends, the gremlins will get their own deepest wood in England. Suddenly, Gus comes down with the flu. He is called out to fly his Hurricane plane. Gremlin Gus, whom Gus has now trained to be good, tells him he shouldn't fly with the illness. After a nearly fatal encounter with gremlins during a dogfight, a hospitalized Gus proposes to his colleagues that they create a gremlin training school. Here the creatures are taught to clean and fix planes. The school becomes a large national operation that cures all gremlins of their naughtiness. And now limping Gus looks as though he will fail his upcoming medical exams. However, under Gremlin Gus, the good gremlins band together from all over the country and help Gus pass his medical exam so he can take to the skies once more. The Fifinella became the official mascot of the Women Air Force Service pilots. Around the time of the Disney-Dahl collaboration, Warner Brothers released a cartoon called Falling Hair, in which Bugs Bunny encounters a creature also called a gremlin. The two are involved in a series of comical airborne hijinks. 20 years later, in 1963, the anthology TV show The Twilight Zone had an episode titled Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. It was about an air passenger who believes he can see a gremlin on the wing of the plane during his passenger flight. It starred an actor known for big performances and was helmed by one of the best action movie directors of all time. 20 years later, the segment was remade for the big screen anthology Twilight Zone the Movie. It starred an actor known for big performances and was helmed by one of the best action movie directors of all time. The film was produced by Steven Spielberg, the music was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, and another more cartoony and colourful segment, It's a Good Life, was directed by Joe Dante. Dante was born in Morristown, New Jersey, but grew up in Livingston, spending as much time at the Saturday matinees as possible, before moving to Parsippany aged 11, which gave him less access to cinemas. He was obsessed with films, particularly genre movies. Dante found a camaraderie with fellow genre movie fans through fan magazines, none more so than Famous Monsters of Filmland. He would eventually write fan articles for Castle of Frankenstein magazine and soon achieved his goal of having a letter printed in Famous Monsters as an article titled Dante's Inferno. Dante intended on being a cartoonist. He enrolled at Philadelphia College of Art. Here he was talked out of cartoons, instead taking film classes. He would team up with producer John Davison and create The Movie Orgy, a random but innovative 7-hour-long compilation feature film comprised of many 16mm clips of nostalgia mashed up with great irreverence. It played in various university venues. Through his friend Jonathan Kaplan, Dante, with no professional movie-making experience, was then hired to cut film trailers for Roger Corman's New World Pictures in Los Angeles. After several years of editing, Dante now wanted to make a feature film. John Davison made a bet with Roger Corman that they could make the cheapest New World movie ever, using a lot of footage from other Corman movies. Dante co-directed the film Hollywood Boulevard with Alan Arkush, and both had to continue their day job of editing trailers as they made the film. According to John Davison, it was shot in 10 days on a budget of $60,000, both a time capsule and meta-satire of mid-70s exploitation films.
Have you been in pictures?
Not recently, I don't do nudity.
While also being a tasteless exploitation film, it allowed Dante to flex his skills as a creative film editor and channel his love of directors such as Mario Bava. Dante then directed a self-aware cash-in on Steven Spielberg's own blockbuster Jaws, called Piranha for Corman. According to Dante in Entertainment Weekly, Jaws studio Universal was threatening an injunction against the film. However, unbeknownst to him, Spielberg himself intervened, suggesting that Dante had won himself a fan. Dante went on to direct the 1981 werewolf film The Howling for Avco Embassy. Both films featured playful humour,
Things I do with special effects these days.
film references and clips from old movies and cartoons, in addition to well-executed monsters. His next feature film would be the debut for Steven Spielberg's production company Amblin. Dante was selected as director and had begun development on this new film prior to Twilight Zone the movie. The writer of this new film was 24-year-old Chris Columbus. He shares a similar story to Dante of a cineast looking beyond his hometown. Columbus was born in Spangler, Pennsylvania, but raised in the small Ohio town of Warren. Movies were his passion. Realizing his future wasn't in a small town, Columbus dreamed of making it in New York City, and similarly to Dante, as a comic book artist at Marvel, before focusing on film. With the support of his parents, Columbus enrolled at NYU in 1978, where he took film classes. After writing and selling a spec script for $5,000 and graduating with an agent, Columbus made a go of making it as a screenwriter in New York City. In his first year, he was paid to write a script that was eventually produced. Unfortunately, by year 2, the work had dried up. Columbus's friend Mitch had noted that since the release of the Steven Spielberg directed Jaws in the mid-70s, there had not been another great monster movie. Columbus lied down to sleep in his undesirable Manhattan bedroom loft. As he drifted off, he could feel mice rubbing against his hand. He felt great fear that they might nibble on his fingers. When repairing cars, Columbus's dad would talk about mayhem-causing creatures called Gremlins being the cause of their breakdown. As a film student, Columbus would eat cheap meals in New York's Chinatown, and he'd visit the boutique shops. He found a Chinese-English dictionary and the Cantonese name for devil, Mogwai. Inspired, Columbus came up with a straight horror film. Within 6 weeks, he wrote a first draft. His agent submitted it to around 50 different producers and production companies. One Friday evening in late 1981, producer Steven Spielberg was heading home from work and passed his secretary's desk. He saw a copy of a script staring back at him. He felt the title was intriguing. That weekend, he read the whole thing. Working with both Spielberg and Joe Dante, Columbus took the Gremlin script through 8 drafts before it was filmed in 1983 and released in 1984. The film begins in an undisclosed American Chinatown. Naive inventor Randall Peltzer is looking for a Christmas gift for his son. He discovers a creature called a mogwai at an antique store, but the wise old man in charge will not sell it to him. His grandson secretly agrees to give Rand the creature in exchange for money, but tells him he must honor 3 important rules. Don't get him wet, don't expose him to bright light or he'll die, and don't feed him after midnight. Rand returns to the small town of Kingston Falls during the festive season. His son Billy works as a clerk at a bank, alongside his co-worker and sympathetic friend, Kate. The money-motivated and materialistic property owner, Mrs. Deagle, is making things quite unhappy for the townspeople, many of whom are out of work or struggling to find payment. Immediately, she wants to have Billy's dog Barney killed for destroying her imported Bavarian snowman. The bank is run by Mr. Corbin and the aspirational Gerald Jones. Gerald is attracted to Kate, who is now working extra shifts for the overly generous Dory, owner of Dory's Tavern, which is also under threat from Mrs. Deagle. Gerald observes how Billy is supporting his whole family and believes he needs to toughen up. Billy's mother reveals to him that Mrs. Deagle has been chasing their family up too. Rand then appears and presents to Billy the Mogwai creature, which he calls Gizmo. The two share an immediate bond. While invited to look at Gizmo, Billy's friend Pete accidentally spills a glass of water onto the furry being, who then gives birth to a handful of less likable Mogwai. One of them acts as a leader and has a distinct furry stripe across its head. Gizmo is not accepted by his offspring. Barney the family dog is then mysteriously found strung up on the porch by Christmas lights. Rand takes the dog to Bill's grandparents before heading off to an inventors convention. Billy takes the Mogwai to Pete's school, where it is to be analysed by science teacher Roy Hansen. The jobless Murray Fudderman, drunk at Dory's bar, mentions about the Gremlins from World War II. He believes that these monsters crashed American fighter planes and were sent over by foreign countries, who continue to send them in modern technology. After Kate convinces him not to drink and drive, Billy walks her home. He discovers that she doesn't celebrate Christmas and notes to him that suicide rates are high in the season. He asks her on a date. The sneaky Mogwai take advantage of their human keepers, and Billy and Mr. Hansen both accidentally feed the creatures after midnight. They develop a thick, slimy outer cocoon. Eventually these hatch, and Mr. Hansen is killed by one of the newly formed beings. Billy's mom is also attacked by the reptilian-looking monsters, but kills 3 of them before Stripe escapes. Billy rescues his mother and Gizmo before following Stripe to the local YMCA, but the creature multiplies in the swimming pool. Billy informs the local sheriff, who doesn't take him seriously. Havoc ensues as Billy and Gizmo, teaming up with Kate, must stop the evil monsters from taking over the town. Paul M. Salmon documented the film's production thoroughly for Cinefex, an American cinematographer. Both were published in November 1984. Executive producer Spielberg envisioned Gremlins as a non-union horror movie. He had thought it could be filmed at a studio in Utah owned by the Osmond brothers. However, Joe Dante saw that the movie would need to exist in a stylized world. He wanted to go with the aesthetic of a movie that reminds you of old movies in order to sell the illusion of the creatures. If everything else was visually styled, then the Gremlins would seem believable in that world. Joe Dante had first pictured the title creatures as stop-motion characters, a technique made famous by Ray Harryhausen, whom he admired. Dante, of course, then realized that this wasn't a time-effective option. The producer of Gremlins would be Mike Fennell, a fellow Corman alumnus who had collaborated with Dante on both Hollywood Boulevard and The Howling. Fennell had been putting together a 3D version of Creature from the Black Lagoon with director Jack Arnold, whom Dante was a big fan of. The title creature was to be designed by Chris Walas, an old Dante associate from Piranha. Having worked most notably at multi-Oscar-winning visual effects house Industrial Light and Magic, where, among many other things, he melted a Nazi on Raiders of the Lost Ark, Walas now had his own creature shop. Fennell asked him what he thought about doing Gremlins. Walas was desperate for a job. He read the second draft of the Gremlin script, dated April 1982. It has several differences to the finished film. There was no Gizmo, only an evil Mogwai that reproduces, and all Mogwai appear for the first third of the film only. Kate is called Tracy. Billy is obsessed with Arthurian legend, reading Once and Future King, which explains why in the film there's crossed swords across the Peltzer family wall, and why Billy draws Mrs. Deagle as a dragon. Note how Billy takes the sword to the swimming pool but abandons it, whereas in the second draft he carries it for the remainder of the movie. Billy is 70 pages into writing his own Arthurian book and is dismissed as a fantasy nerd, so when he comes to warn the police about the monsters, they think he's stuck in his mind. Billy buys an Arthurian sword from an old Irish guy in an antique shop. His name is Dory Dougal. It is Dory who tells the story of his father dying in a chimney, a speech which was given to Kate. Dory becomes a non-character in the film. A jock bank guard called Gary is particularly bothersome of Billy. Gary likes Kate, and his brother is Officer Brent, who works with the sheriff. You can see in the finished film that he evolved into a similar character. Billy isn't as reserved in this earlier draft, and he eventually calls Mrs. Deagle an ugly old fart whom he hopes breaks her neck. A Mr. Futters is neighbours with Mrs. Deagle's husband, and both aren't particularly nice. The Gremlins are carnivorous and flesh-eating. They eat Mrs. Deagle, they eat Pete, they eat a family and an old man in a McDonald's, but leave the food. They eat Gary the guard, and they eat Dory. Billy traps a gremlin in a red toolbox and uses it as bait for the other gremlins. The climax happens in a greenhouse. This time the gremlins are defeated by sunrise. You can see how the setting from the film's climax evolved from this. After a reunion with Rand in the hospital, a couple of workmen find the toolbox. It's dumped in a lake, leaving room for a sequel. Both Joe Dante and Chris Columbus have mentioned that in an earlier draft of the script, Billy is the same age as young teenager Pete. Apparently in that version, the head of Billy's mother is cut off and rolls down the stairs. The most significant part of the second draft was that Billy had no bond with the main Mogwai character, and its offspring are completely interchangeable versions of itself. Based on this second draft, Chris Walas would only need to create the furry Mogwai for the first third of the film before the furry beings turn into the gremlin monsters for the remainder of the movie. Walas was initially overwhelmed by the number of gremlins that the script required, but loved the scope of the project. He would hire many new entrants to the film industry, as well as many former ILM employees. Although the film would be made for more money than originally envisioned by Spielberg, the budget was still relatively tight. The armies of gremlins made for the film would cost $1.5 million, the same price to bring the single title character of Spielberg's E.T. to the screen. To determine how to make all of the creatures, Walas needed storyboards of all the sequences they appeared in. This would allow him to be able to budget and work out what and how much of the creatures he needed to build or show on screen. Joe Dante, with his cartoonist training, storyboarded most of the effects sequences himself, while simultaneously directing Twilight Zone the movie. In the second draft script, the Mogwai are described as 11 inches tall, standing upright on two legs, with 2 arms and small 4-fingered hands. Its body is covered in fluffy brown fur, with piercing, big sad eyes, long pointed ears, and a tiny black nose above a wide mouth with small square teeth. The general Mogwai design took 7 months to come up with. It featured a half puppy and half monkey nose. As Steven Spielberg was a fan of Cocker Spaniels, it was decided for white and brown patterning to be given to the fur. According to Chris Walas in Gremlins: A Puppet Story, many already completed puppets had to be defurred and refurred to match this creative decision. With 2 months before production began, Spielberg also made a crucial narrative decision that would impact Walas's workload to an even greater level. He wanted to make the first Mogwai that Rand purchases into a good creature that has a bond with Billy and doesn't transform. This devious Mogwai became the gentle Gizmo. While Gizmo was ultimately a wonderful choice, being decided so late in pre-production made the work considerably more difficult. Joe Dante decided that wherever possible, he would have Gizmo held by the actors or in a rucksack. This would somewhat simplify the creature work. The Mogwai had urethane and latex hands. Their arms were 2.5 to 3 inches long. Synthetic fur was used and the faces were made of latex. Of the 20 Mogwai puppets built at a height of 10 inches, 3 had a maximum amount of mechanics compacted into them. With small complete hand-machined aluminium tooling, they had jointed legs, mechanical arms and fully articulated heads, and were totally cable-controlled. These puppets could blink, move their eyes, wiggle their noses, and move their heads and ears up and down. There were 10 different Gizmo faces with different facial expressions. They were connected to Gizmo's head before each shot with glue, which could be hidden by the fur. Walas had wanted the puppets to be enhanced more using visual effects with blue screen opticals, but these were deemed too expensive. Other ideas were to shoot the puppets against black, a technique used for the character of Topo Gigio as seen in the old Ed Sullivan show. Walas also did a lot of tests to make the Mogwai walk, but little of any of this made its way into the finished film. As the Mogwai puppets were quite compact, 3 super faces were used for big expression. They measured 10 inches tall and a width of 1 foot, with ears 3 feet across, operated by cable controls on a slightly oversized set. They were covered with yak hair. 2 Gizmo super faces were built, one with a positive expression and one with a negative expression. Sometimes an old Hollywood technique known as a Texas switch was used, where a Mogwai was placed out of frame and replaced by a different model all in the same shot, selling the illusion that it was the same creature. By contrast, the script described the transformed monsters as having a body of rock-hard, rippled armor, muscular arms and legs with sharp claws, sharp white horns instead of ears, a long pointed reptilian tail that thrashes back and forth, large bulging green eyes, a huge grinning mouth, and countless gleaming white sharp teeth. This was not far from how Pauline Gower had first drawn the Gremlin nearly 50 years prior. After discussions of using monkeys in pieces of costume, and Joe Dante meeting a chaotic monkey that defecated in a studio office, Chris Walas pushed for bony and reptilian puppets. Practical reasons dictated the design of the monsters having short legs, as these parts of the body are hard to do on a puppet. The characters needed long arms because they're so active. This also meant the camera would mostly only need to see the gremlins from the waist up to capture their arm movements. After tons of tests, 100 plus standard gremlin puppets were constructed at 23 inches tall with 10-inch bat ears. They had urethane bodies covered in latex with 14 different variations, all in a greenish-brown colour. Several types of gremlin were made. Walas had what he referred to as super gremlins, with a full range of facial movements, as well as cable-controlled ears. The expressive ear design is the one element that would link the Mogwai to the gremlins. The back of the heads were mechanized wherever possible. There were 2 sets of heavy and fully mechanized arms, and they needed a dozen operators. There were also only 2 types of super gremlin bodies. Cables were entered either in the back of the puppet, or they were freestanding with the cables entering from the waist up. In the kitchen scene, the Super Gremlin had 62 cables running off of it. The puppets were heavy, and puppeteers and cables were sometimes everywhere. Reverse monitors were used by the puppeteers to view their performances in context as close to the camera as possible. Other details created for the Gremlins included nictating membranes in the eyelids. Joe Dante had an idea for glowing eyes, but this was largely abandoned except in a few instances. John Berg, who had helped engineer many creatures in the Star Wars films, was involved with various single-purpose rigs for the puppets. A cable slave system with mechanized arms was used in this sequence, made of aluminium. Walas also had what he named as Zero puppets, which were basically Muppet-like hand puppets. There were a dozen different mix and match gremlin heads. The cocoons were made of foam latex and dressed with dry ice. The Gremlins and Mogwai were operated via rods, radio control, marionette and handwork, but cable systems were used whenever possible, and a removable hand control system was used to detach when needed. The leader of Gizmo's offspring was named Stripe and given a mohawk hairstyle, which was a problem-solving way to have an identifiable character that transitions from Mogwai to Gremlin. A test was shot in January 1983 by Spielberg's regular cinematographer Alan Daviau. It convinced studio Warner Brothers to fully commit to the project. Steven Spielberg then went to England to film Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. He would only return during production for a couple of days when injured Indiana Jones star Harrison Ford was sent to an LA hospital. The work by Walas also strengthened Joe Dante's argument to film the movie in a Hollywood studio space. It was going to be very expensive to do the creature effects, with many monsters and requirements, such as having puppeteers working on and underneath the floor with holes cut in the sets. This was prohibitive for location shooting. Under production designer James Spencer, the town of Kingston Falls was filmed on the Universal backlot. It was later used for the town of Hill Valley in the film Back to the Future from the following year. The now demolished Columbia Ranch was host to other locations, such as a swimming pool and the Peltzer and Fudderman homes. The sheriff's office, filmed at Washington Middle School in Pasadena, was the only interior not photographed in a film studio. At the Burbank Studios, the New York street set doubled as Chinatown. Most of Gremlins was shot on sound stages at the Burbank Studios. Some of the sets were reused. For example, the biology lab set became the projector room for the cinema. The Christmas set production was filmed from late April to early August 1983, with the exterior sets covered in fake snow of many different forms. Special effects supervisor Bob McDonald created the wintry weather through the use of snowmakers and gypsum sand, with limestone for snowbanks, foam from air runways used to stop troubled airplanes, as well as through the use of flocking added to the trees. There was a production hiatus from August to September, so Chris Walas could catch up with the puppet building, and then from September to late October, most of the shots featuring just puppets were photographed. This included the mob of creatures in Dory's pub, filmed on stage 15 at Warner Brothers. Dante and a skeleton crew were assembled from October 24th to November the 1st to get the remaining pickups. Gremlins was photographed by John Horror, who had shot both The Howling and the It's a Good Life Twilight Zone the movie segment for Dante. Dante believed in treating the movie like a cartoon or dream to sell the unreality. In the Gremlins issue of American Cinematographer magazine, John Horror states that his own artistic heart and soul lies back in the good, rich black and white days of such films as Night of the Hunter and Mildred Pierce. In its lighting, Gremlins has a look that favours shadows reminiscent of black and white. However, a big gaudy colour influence for Joe Dante was the horror films of Mario Bava and the saturated colour of Chuck Jones' Looney Tunes cartoons. Chuck Jones himself even has a cameo in the movie. Horror shot the film on large Panavision PSR cameras, which he thought were great for undertaking the film's many fast pans and Dutch angled shots. While he did an amazing job realising Joe Dante's visual sensibility, Horror did feel that if it was done badly, it could end up looking like the 1966 Adam West Batman TV show. Horror also used an 85C filter and a #1 Tiffin fog filter on the camera lens to help the fake snow look more authentic on daytime scenes. According to the American Cinematographer issue of Gremlins 2, John Horror often shot puppet sequences on the first Gremlins movie at different frame rates, other than the standard 24 frames per second. This was because of a detectable elasticity to the puppets. Away from the physical trickery during the shooting of the main unit, the film had a few very effective visual effects. The company Fantasy 2, who were also hard at work on the movie Terminator, provided one stop-motion animation shot for the scene of the Gremlins multiplying in the street. The shot was animated by legendary pedal steel guitar player Sneaky Pete Kleinow, using 40 Gremlins puppets. Dream Quest Images provided 3 major matte paintings for the film. The first was for the opening, created by artist Rocco Joffre, expanding Kingston Falls beyond the Universal backlot set, complete with animated birds. The most significant of DreamQuest's matte contributions was the enhancement of the cinema, for which a very limited amount of Gremlin puppets could be provided to fill seating only 8 rows across and 8 rows deep. Black velvet was placed behind this for matting. The same 8x8 seats were rephotographed and composited with a Mark Sullivan matte-painted cinema wall to create the illusion of a packed cinema. A Gremlin was blue screen composited, hanging into the foreground. The final matte painting shot was the evocative closing of the film, in which Grandfather removes Gizmo from Kingston Falls. Projection specialist Hansard provided a few composites for the film. Front projection shots of the cinema screen were used to show Snow White being screened. This involved a screen of reflective 3M material, placing a two-way mirror at a right angle to the camera, on which a dull image of Snow White was projected, reflected back and appearing bright through the camera lens. Hansard also provided rear projection shots of Gizmo driving a pink car. Peter Curran's company VCE provided cell animation for the movie screen that appears to show the Gremlins chasing Kate and Billy. It was projected by Hansard. Once again, Steven Spielberg made another request. A final moment was to be filmed at George Lucas's multi-Oscar winning special effects facility, Industrial Light and Magic. Of this, Breakdancing Gremlin. Tonally, Gremlins plays with dark humour and the fantastical, sometimes becoming a cartoon, but it veers on the side of sincerity. The Gremlins engage in all kinds of cartoon violence and physics, but these actions have consequences for the human characters. The result often feels shocking rather than silly and surreal. Some of the visual humour veers into the absurd for comic effect. For example, Mrs. Deagle's house has only 2 stories, but the interior looks to have about 6. The film has a tremendously well-judged sense of humour that is carefully sprinkled but never overshadows its foundation of horror and mystery. Goofy asides with Rand's inventions are unexpected and silly, but never undo the characters or the tone of the film. In the stories of wartime airborne gremlins, the attacking creatures were used to blame faulty technology and human error. The Gremlins movie begins with a naive inventor trying to sell his new, already broken technology. We then see his son Billy with a car that doesn't work. There are numerous faulty Peltzer inventions throughout the film, and this is all before the Mogwai transform into monsters, and they have no impact over any of these contraptions. Rand even names the Mogwai he has purchased as Gizmo, which means nameless gadget. As we know, the wartime Gremlins were used to up morale and not let the side down. At the time of filming Gremlins in 1983, World War II was less than 40 years ago, with many who fought still alive. Pauline Gower had singled out foggy mountainous conditions as characteristic of a Gremlin country. In Gremlins, the connection to the wartime creatures is Murray Futterman.
World War II. Good old WWII.
And if he shares the similar age of actor Dick Miller, born in 1921, it means he might have been a drafted USAF officer. Fetterman's take on the Gremlin lore is the xenophobic fear of non-Americans.
Goddamn foreign cars. Goddamn foreign cars. How'd you like to bring your plow for a tune-up and find it loaded with foreign parts? Goddamn foreign TV.
Regardez-moi. Il nous reste encore un mois. M'écouterez-vous?
You gotta watch out for the foreigners because they plant gremlins in their machinery. That's the same gremlins brought down our planes in the big one.
And he believes the practice has continued beyond World War II. In Dory's Tavern, where Fetterman spends his evenings drinking, an American World War II bomber can be seen on the wall, and another aptly ends up with a bullet hole in it from a gremlin. To underline his bad judgment as an American, the filmmakers have given Murray Fetterman an old Richard Nixon presidential campaign poster in his living room. Fetterman is a man out of time.
Smiling Jack and Little Abner.
Oh, well, Mr. Fetterman, they don't run those comics anymore.
They don't.
And Dick Miller brings humanity, humour and sympathy to what could have been a one-note paranoid bigot. You could easily read into Fetterman having post-war trauma as he drinks himself numb. The interaction with his wife Sheila, especially when savoured on a big screen, gives the sense that this is a deeply loveless marriage.
Sheila, will you quit messing with the TV?
You have the thingy.
Huh? Oh.
Sheila seems hugely unsympathetic to Murray's claims of gremlins, calling him out on his paranoia, even as the creatures drive his snowplow into their living room. Leading on from the idea of wartime morale, Kate mentions how Fetterman lost his job and just wants someone to listen to him. She then mentions about the issue of Christmas-time suicide. There is a generally strong air of repressed emotion and depression throughout the film. This is immediately apparent from the effect of Mrs. Deagle creating unaffordable living for the Kingston Falls residents. The film's most infamous reveal of character backstory also links to this thread. Inspired by a Garner Wilson illustration that Chris Columbus had seen in a National Lampoon magazine, ironically designed to inspire laughter, Kate informs Billy that her father died on Christmas Day in the family chimney dressed as Santa. She only discovered it because of the smell of his dead body when she lit the fireplace, the subtext being that she blames herself for this. The entire scene is underlined by a physically mangled Christmas sign above Billy to visually tell you how this whole experience makes us look at Christmas in a more downbeat way. Just as effectively, there is a scene where Billy's mother cuts an onion as she watches an emotional film on TV, before confiding in Billy that Deagle has been trying to contact his father. Is she crying because of the film's emotional climax, the financial stress on her family, or is it just the effect of the vegetable? The film she is watching is Frank Capra's 1946 classic, It's a Wonderful Life. Suicide and depression also linked to this film, which Gremlins most closely pays homage to. In that film, set in the picturesque American town of Bedford Falls, we see the life of the selfless George Bailey, who dreamed of leaving his hometown, but gave it all up to run his father's charitable community savings and loans company, doing his part back home during World War II against greedy bank owner Mr. Potter, while his heroic brother went off to fight war. When all of his sacrifices catch up with him and Bailey contemplates taking his own life, Bailey's guardian angel intervenes. After a Dickensian tour of life in the town had there been no George Bailey, in true Christmas and charitable spirit, everyone George touched pays him back. The comparisons to It's a Wonderful Life are significant, as according to Dante and Columbus, Gremlins was originally intended to be something of a satire of that movie. Aside from the obvious location, the Christmas setting, the savings and loans occupation of the main character, the courting between Billy and Kate, a scene in a young person's swimming pool, the vision of a once pretty community gone to hell, the film is framed around seasonal suicide and depressed feelings, and with a very Christian view to the afterlife. But whereas It's a Wonderful Life has angels, Gremlins has a creature with the Cantonese name for devil.
You can't begin to spend all the money you've got.
Oh, I suppose I should give it to miserable failures like you and that idiot brother of yours to spend for me.
The bank and I have the same purpose in life, to make money, not to support a lot of deadbeats.
The odious Mr. Potter from that film has limited leg mobility. The selfish Mrs. Deagle has her own variation of this, which the Gremlins take advantage of. It's one of the few times in the film where the Gremlins sabotage technology, true to their airborne roots. They give Deagle the resolution that Potter never had. George Bailey's father had the proud mantra, "All you can take with you is that which you've given away." It's never stated outright until the sequel, but like George Bailey and even to some extent Chris Columbus and Joe Dante, you get the sense that Billy loves his family, but would really like to leave his small hometown behind him for creative pursuits. Zach Galligan has a real sense of innocence as Billy. You believe his bond with the furry Gizmo and his terrorized response to the evil creatures. You feel the threat. It never becomes apparent that he's acting against puppets on Christmas-themed sets, filmed during the spring and summer. This is also true of Phoebe Cates as Kate, particularly in scenes involving danger, even when it's so heightened, especially in the bar scene where the Gremlins become cartoon characters. Billy and Kate are both wholesome, sweet, naive young people. Their romance has a purity to it, as if it's true love. Billy is a little more careless, but they are both empathetic with charitable values. In Columbus's second draft, they are described as being 25 and 26 years old. Both Billy and Kate are an anchor of sincerity to the film. The adorably cute Gizmo is introduced via a jump scare, but turns out to be another naive, pure force of good. In fact, Gizmo is actively a very responsible creature. He doesn't want to eat, and he keeps away from water and sunlight. He's more responsible than either Rand or Billy Peltzer. Hoyt Axton as Rand opens and closes the film, and it is sort of his story. Both Billy and he learn about responsibility, but Billy is the protagonist, going from being careless to getting things together, even if it's Gizmo who eventually defeats Stripe at the end. Pat Hingle had auditioned for the part of Rand, and according to Dante, had played him as a failed inventor. By the director's account, Hingle gave a tear-jerking performance, but it threw the film off balance. Axton, by comparison, has an overly relaxed sensibility and is never defeatist, to the point where you wish his own family members might bring him down to reality. A dreamer who never complains, although it does make you wonder how he financially supported his family with their own home, before Billy got his bank job. At one point, he sees the Mogwai as a commodity he could brand as his own, but he seems too disorganized to pursue that idea. Frances Lee McCain as Lynn Peltzer seems always on edge with the various threats to her and her family's existence, monsters and otherwise. The character is unconditionally supportive of her husband and his useless inventions, even though she knows they are never going to sell. Her big moment is the kitchen scene, as she takes on the evil Gremlins. In the second draft, she was a weak character who has a Valium addiction and is killed by Gremlins in the attic. In the film, she is more similar to the strong female characters of Dante's earlier work. The sequence is completely against the structure of a monster movie of that era, where the expectation would be for us to see a damsel in distress becoming a victim. After the sequence's violent burst of adrenaline, her double reach for the kitchen knives is such a great touch that gets the audience cheering. Mr. Corbin, played by Edward Andrews, and Judge Reinhold as Gerald, are two characters who are set up early on in the film, but then just disappear. A scene cut from the film shows Corbin more as a punctuality-obsessed character. In another deleted scene, we find out Mr. Corbin was killed by Gremlins, and Billy and Kate discover Gerald hidden in a bank vault. He goes from being plain creepy to deranged, believing himself to be the immediate replacement to Mr. Corbin as a bank manager. Holly Holliday, who was only in her mid-40s at the time of filming Gremlins, played Mrs. Deagle very convincingly as an elderly woman. Vulnerable with a supposed heart condition, which she exploits as and when she needs to. On the TV news report at the end of the film, it's revealed that Mrs. Deagle was previously married to Donald Deagle, a stock swindler. Representing her husband is a 1940s photograph of actor Edward Arnold, who had played the villain in several Frank Capra movies. Arnold appeared in 1938's You Can't Take It With You, in which he plays a banker who wants to buy up an entire residential area. He also played a politics-manipulating businessman in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, who has bought up land illegally to sell off to the government. And in Meet John Doe, he also played a businessman manipulating politics. A deleted scene was filmed for Gremlins, in which Kate explains to Billy in Mr. Corbin's office that Mrs. Deagle is forcing the bank to foreclose on all of the house-owning townsfolk who used to work at the local noodle factory, so the land can be sold to a chemical company. The houses of Billy and Kate's parents are also included in this. Another deleted scene shows the Futtermans reflecting on this.
I guess that's the end of my career in noodles.
Did you put any real pressure on these people of yours to pay those mortgages?
Time's up bad, Mr. Potter. A lot of these people are out of work.
Well, foreclosed.
Until learning about this subplot, I always felt it was quite horrific watching an otherwise greedy but vulnerable old woman meeting her violent demise. But maybe revealing her full plot to the audience takes the edge off of the Gremlin's shocking treatment of Mrs. Deagle. In the final cut of the film, we sort of get the basic gist of Deagle's greed, but without the full information. In the opening, Kate gets Billy to sign a petition to turn Dory's into a landmark as Deagle wants to take his lease away. We never know exactly what the relationship is between Mrs. Deagle and Rand Peltzer. We are told by Billy's mother that Deagle has been on the phone to him, and Deagle mentions having to listen to his excuses for 10 years. It's only before Mrs. Deagle dies that we discover she runs a real estate business with this establishing shot. Earlier in the film, she meets a Mrs. Harris who wants to delay a payment, and Deagle makes it clear that her motivation is to make money. The bank setting is really the only way for the audience to deduce what she does early on. It's not clear what Mr. Hansen's relationship is with Billy exactly, or why he seeks him out. In the second draft of the script, he is introduced to Billy by Pete. The character of Hansen is humorless and used for exposition, but Glyn Turman makes him silent and stealth-like. Taunting the Mogwai he names as Earl through the bars of a cage, giving the transformed gremlin every reason to kill him. Barney the dog, played by Mushroom, looks somewhat threatened when Gizmo comes along, but the little Mogwai seems to appreciate him. Then there are the title characters of the movie. As Mogwai, the evil smirking creatures are rowdy, energetic, deceitful, and collectively plotting against Billy, with Gizmo as the outsider. It does make you wonder, are they Gizmo's offspring, or are they some kind of virus? Gizmo looks displeased and disowns them, and the feeling is mutual. But then why doesn't Gizmo just convince Billy to immediately kill them all in Mogwai form? Because of their bright light rule, the Gremlins always feel like demons in the shadows. This is true even before their transformation, hidden in a cardboard box as Mogwai, and also in the later scenes where no humans appear on screen, and it becomes a series of puppet variety sketches like The Muppet Show, complete with the Treg Brown library of Warner Brothers cartoon sounds to add a further cartoon element to the little monsters. When first sighted, the Gremlins evoke the kind of feeling you get from seeing a spider or snake in a domestic setting, with just their camouflage patterning identifiable in the shadows. Despite having an asexual reproduction system, the Mogwai and Gremlins are referred to as male. They mostly behave this way too, feeling very mischievously adolescent. The only female Gremlin is in drag, wearing Mrs. Deagle's wig. The Gremlins feel like they are a comment on stereotypically unsocialized boys and angry young men. They sing along to an army of all-male dwarves. They behave like bullies. They enjoy sugary foods, as well as smoking, picking their noses, being served alcohol, and playing video games. They attack everyone in Kingston Falls, but in the bar scene they accept the presence of a pretty young woman serving their every need and casually harass her. Maybe subconsciously that's why it's so satisfying to see a distressed mother take them out one by one. There's great entertainment in watching the gremlin monsters trying to imitate humans, from riding tricycles and threading film projectors to singing when they don't have developed voice muscles. It's also hilarious how they adapt to reading English so quickly, and that this very human skill can be used to keep the plot moving. They instinctively know the intricacies of their complex life system. There are many asides with whole scenes where the creatures imitate the worst behaviour of humans. Mark Dodson and Fred Newman would voice most of the Gremlins. Frank Welker, a giant in the world of cartoon voiceovers, provided the sound of Stripe. However, his friend, stand-up comic Howie Mandel, became the voice of Gizmo. To create the squeaky effect, a more innovative approach was taken to the standard of just speeding up the performer's voice. Scenes were put onto video, slowed down by 30%, Mandel would perform to them, and then that new audio would be sped up by 30%. This prevented it from sounding like Alvin and the Chipmunks. In his direction, Joe Dante first and foremost in Daylight and at Night gives Gremlins an ominous, suspenseful and atmospheric feel. There are a fair amount of unremarkable but empty spaces in which characters can sense something bad is about to happen. Even the inside of the family home feels unnerving. At night, the visuals are so horror-oriented, with mist, darkness and twinkling lights, not unlike the work Dante so admired of Mario Bava. The Christmas setting presented in the film is either overly nostalgic to the point of being worn out and depressed, or it's a chilly, downbeat interpretation full of darkness. Kingston Falls has all the elements to appear like a quaint Norman Rockwell town, but is visually full of ugly beige, and the snowy outdoors are seen through so many camera filters, it often creates a dreary look that, fittingly, helps the tone of the film. We never see anything beyond the town, so when everything goes wrong, there's an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia, knowing that you are very shortly going to come face to face with the monsters. Aside from the beautiful images of Billy and Kate walking home, which strongly evoke the flashbacks from It's a Wonderful Life, there's no other moment in the film that makes me feel genuinely comfortable or upbeat, as you're constantly expecting the next scare, even during the sweet moments of family. After the creatures are defeated, there's barely a breath for triumph as the film hits a dour end. Billy and Gizmo are separated, and you can really feel the grandfather berate everyone. It's a lonely outsider's movie, beginning in a seedy Chinatown alleyway and ending under the moon in empty suburbia, with nobody around to watch. Dante's intention was to make a film that felt like old films, rather than the 1983 it was actually filmed in. It's covered in generational nostalgia for times gone, opening with a nostalgic Phil Spector Christmas song, which in 1984 would speak to anyone sentient 20 years before, as well as a 60s Johnny Mathis song heard in the Peltzer home. There are a handful of distinctly 80s elements to Kingston Falls. The music of Peter Gabriel, Nile Rodgers and Quarterflash play over the speakers at Dory's bar, and the most dated pop cultural reference is an homage to Flashdance, complete with singer Michael Sembello recreating the magic of his song Maniac from that soundtrack to channel the pop culture of the hit summer movie released while Gremlins was being filmed. Outside of these, the backward-looking Capra suburbia makes everything feel older than it actually is. The cast also reflects this, with the few youths surrounded by middle-aged to elderly character actors that Dante had grown up watching. Bill Shallot as a priest who looks out for himself.
Last-minute package, Father.
Be my guest.
Harry Carey Jr. as an unhelpful citizen.
Maybe I'll put him in my spin dryer on high heat.
That'd do it all right.
Ken Toby plays a gas station worker and has one scene with Rand, who is of a similar age to him, but the interaction couldn't possibly be more cold. Scott Brady appears as a horribly patronising sheriff, assisted by the younger, irresponsible Deputy Brent, played by Jonathan Banks. A film that reminds you of other films is of course loaded with references to other films. Frank Capra is the main cinematic influence to Dante, not just with It's a Wonderful Life and the use of Edward Arnold, but even the classroom science film is the American school classic, Hemo the Magnificent, directed by Frank Capra. The Clark Gable film To Please a Lady appears on a television that Gizmo is watching. It replaced a classic Warner Brothers cartoon, Feed the Kitty. This inspired the car chase at the end of the film. It was felt having a cartoon earlier in the film might lessen the impact of Snow White later on. Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers is also seen on Gizmo's TV, which Dante very liberally models his own pod transformation scenes on, as well as the use of Dutched camera angles. References to more films appear throughout the movie. Jean Cocteau's Orpheus, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a Road Warrior poster, a reference to Frank Sinatra. An unseen Kingston Falls radio DJ, Rialto Ricky, makes a meta joke about Orson Welles and has a billboard resembling Spielberg's own throwback to old Hollywood. A picture of the Wolfman is seen during the birth of the Mogwai. Robbie the Robot from movie Forbidden Planet, The Time Machine. Steven Spielberg himself has a cameo, as does composer Jerry Goldsmith. His music score is key to the atmosphere and tone of the movie. The film begins in nostalgic old movie fashion with a new arrangement of the 1940s Warner Brothers logo, composed by Max Steiner. Outside of this, the rest of the score isn't all backward looking. Leaning on the sonic artifice of new synthesizers including the Yamaha DX7, it's mainly a suspenseful, magical horror score, starting with the mystical ambience of Chinatown. However, the score also uses the technology to create musical humor, with sampled animal sounds and even some elements of Dante's beloved Golden Age cartoon scoring for the creatures, especially with the signature Gremlins rag. Most importantly, Goldsmith's score also has heart central to it, through Gizmo's peaceful singing, sung by a 14-year-old Eileen Keyes from the Synagogue of Jerry Goldsmith. Sound designer Mark Mangini used an ARP 2600 synthesizer and eventide harmonizer with added vibrato to treat her voice. Goldsmith weaves this effortlessly into his love theme that he uses for Billy and Kate, and basically to underscore any scenes of affection throughout the film. As I have mentioned, Murray Futterman repeatedly shows a backward-looking fear of the non-American.
You don't find American machinery doing that. Our stuff can take anything.
Billy, in his naivety, eventually accepts those views.
They're gremlins, Kate. Just like Mr. Futterman said.
Throughout the film, we see the reoccurring image of an American flag. With great enthusiasm, Gizmo chooses to wave a little American flag in the sheriff's office.
Patriotic little fella, ain't he?
The film itself also plays with a backward-looking fear of the non-American. Synopsis magazine notes that at one point in the writing stage, Gizmo was nearly to be found at a curio shop located in the Texas desert. There was much debate about where the Chinatown setting was. In the second draft of the film, the grandfather was described solely as Oriental Man. Gizmo was first discovered by Rand in Hong Kong, but the logic of him travelling abroad while broke and coming through customs with the creature couldn't be justified. The film instead has Rand discovering Gizmo boxed in the basement of an unusually mystical-looking American Chinatown, bathed in unwintery warm weather, the exact location of which is never revealed. In 1985, Joe Dante told Starburst magazine that the grandfather role will not exactly advance the Chinese race, but it's a fairy tale. It's an affectionate stereotype. Still, it is nonetheless the kind of portrayal of Chinese people that probably went out in 1940. He continued, but it's all germane to the plot, because at the beginning of the picture, you really don't know where Chinatown is. You don't know if it's out of the country, in the country, or what it is. It's sort of a state of mind, as opposed to a real place. The mysterious grandfather, played with great presence by Key Luke, is set up as an intimidating, silent figure who plays chess by himself. He has a blind eye which makes you question his own vision. The grandson speaks on his behalf, before it is eventually revealed that the grandfather can in fact speak fluent English when necessary. Even his own grandson makes fun of him. The grandson wears a New York baseball cap and Rand pays him in American dollar bills, implying that he is an American boy of Chinese heritage and that the Chinatown is American. The Mogwai has a name that means devil in Cantonese. Grandfather has a strong connection with the Mogwai, talking to him in a different language, implying the creature is possibly also of Chinese or other heritage. Speaking to Empire magazine about the Mogwai, Joe Dante stated, "In my mind they came from China, and were the results of the mating of a dragon and a panda." At the end of the film at the Peltzer house, the grandfather is reintroduced all in black as a jump scare, making you believe he might be a supernatural magician, having entered the family home without knocking. Then he reveals he stopped off at a gas station on his way there, bringing everything back down to earth. The grandfather and Mogwai mythology is presented as a kind of asceticism. Gizmo doesn't eat once during the film, or even see sunlight, and he reproduces without having sex. His only activity is to sing a beautiful, meditative song. If the Mogwai is indulged in any way, it creates creatures of hedonistic chaos. The grandfather takes a very dim view on modern Western consumerism, even though he's an American himself, running his own business.
I'll bet every kid in America would like to have one of these. They might even replace the dog as the family pet.
You do with Mogwai what your society has done with all of nature's gifts.
It's an interesting conflict because without argument, the grandfather is the smartest and wisest character in the movie. He keeps a watchful eye over Gizmo and obviously has done so successfully for many decades, strictly abiding by the rules of ownership. The Gremlins copy the worst behaviors of humans, and Gizmo is isolated from the dangers of the world around him. By contrast, Billy removes Gizmo from his box, speaks to him in English, and lets him gorge on youthful American pop culture. At one point, Billy asks if Gizmo is having fun, to which he replies,
Pretty neat, huh?
Gizmo repeats the word as if it's a new experience that Billy has introduced him to, away from the discipline of the grandfather. Through Billy, Gizmo is influenced by television, which directly affects him defeating the villain at the film's climax. Despite this, the grandfather is horrified that Gizmo has been exposed to television, but he does acknowledge the bond between Billy and the Mogwai. Billy treats Gizmo as a friend and not as a dangerous animal, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a universal Spielbergian friendship that magically transcends the human-animal bond. Anyone who has ever owned a pet can relate to this blurring of a fine line, especially when they are no longer there. Not unlike a boy and his alien. Billy's only irresponsibility was failing to prevent water from being spilled onto Gizmo. But what links depressed feelings, angry young males, and a nostalgic, proudly American community that favours the rich and reminds you of old movies? The year of Gremlins' release, former old Hollywood actor turned president Ronald Reagan was campaigning to nostalgic images of white picket fences and Capra Rockwell Americana.
Why would we ever want to return to where we were? less than 4 short years ago.
Having spent 4 years decrying the public spending of the last few decades and hoping to restore the feeling of post-war prosperity against a horrific recession, homelessness, tax and welfare cuts, and unemployment, a sentiment had been felt among many.
Mr. President, my question to you is, what can you do for the poor people? I've seen what you've done for the rich.
You can feel that historical context in Gremlins.
The world's changing, Peltzer. You gotta change with it. You gotta be tough.
The film is mostly set in local business areas, a yard full of unsold Christmas trees, a bank, Dory's bar, a cinema and department store, outlets for money and materialism that the townsfolk cannot afford. On the outside, Kingston Falls is dressed in a Rockwell Caprese shell, a warm, commercialized image of American Christian celebration. On the inside, it's full of festering rot, a town that benefits only the few and everyone else suffers. As in the RAF stories, the Gremlins are blamed when technological problems occur. However, the point of the film is that ultimately, the creatures, like Fetterman's obsession with the foreign, are really just a scapegoat. Gremlins is often a very mean-spirited film, but its message is simple and compassionate. Whether you're a father finding your son a novelty gift, a boy showing off his new pet, a real estate owner managing their tenants, or a parent surprising their daughter on Christmas Eve, responsibility for yourself and others comes before personal gain, even when it's needed. A view also shared by the grandfather. It's fitting that the Gremlin leader, Stripe, has a mohawk atop his head, evoking the anti-establishment anarchic youth movement of the time, punk. The film's poster has Stripe creating punk-like graffiti.
Groups of boys dance together, diving headfirst, punching, kicking, and slamming into each other.
What is punk? Why is it different than the Woodstock generation or beatniks, or is it?
Well, I think it's different because it has no social value.
In the USA of the early 1980s, many male and female punks were deeply critical of Reagan's politics and the future awaiting them.
You have a whole generation of people who are only concerned with their own comfort and their own wealth.
Kingston Falls wasn't a victim of Gremlins, it desperately needed Gremlins. The community needed to take responsibility for itself and its actions, let alone take responsibility for looking after a mogwai and obeying its rules. What makes Gremlins a great movie is that it takes the central idea of the RAF Gremlins lore, but uses it to create its own mythology and its own story and original characters, while being true to the filmmakers that made it. It ties the horror aspirations of its writer, the blockbuster instincts of its producer, and the nostalgic American pop cultural sensibility of its director. It did this all through innovative filmmaking creativity, behind and in front of the camera. The film also treads a very delicate tonal line, mixing the golden age cartoons that first brought the RAF Gremlin legend to Hollywood, with the suspense of the foremost contemporary blockbuster monster movie of the era. Yes, Gremlins is a fun Steven Spielberg-produced monster movie. Gizmo is cute, and this still breaks my heart. But it is also an angry film, with something to say that reflects the time it was made. It's of course ironic that a film about moral responsibility was criticised on release for an irresponsible approach to content rating. All of this, controversy included, no doubt contributed to why the film was a huge success when it debuted and beyond. Soon after the film was released, it was followed by a long list of little creature movies that dominated the 1980s and further decades. Inevitably, there was immediate talk of a Gremlins sequel, but that's another video.